Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on World Prematurity Day. Astardi Medical's webinar today is presented by Dr. Richard Schanler on human milk benefits for the preterm infant. I'm Tammy Jansen, co-founder and CFO of Astardi Medical. For those of you who don't know us, Astardi Medical is a precision nutrition company providing digital solutions to support nutrition and feeding practices for preterm infants in the NICU. We're hosting a series of educational webinars this year, all focused on the growth and development of preterm infants and the importance of feeding, nutrition, and gut health. I'm thrilled to share our incredible lineup of upcoming speakers with you. You can find the details for all of our webinars, both past and future, on our website. Please mark your calendars and join us for our next webinar on December 16th for a presentation by Dr. Michael Georgioff on nutrition of the preterm infant to promote brain health. Dr. Georgioff is the Martin Lenz Harrison Land Grant Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Minnesota. He is Executive Vice Chair of Pediatrics and Director of the Center for Neurobehavioral Development at the university. He is an internationally recognized expert on the effects of nutrition on the developing brain, and specifically the effects of iron status on neural circuits involved in learning and memory processing. Watch for the invitation to Dr. Georgioff's webinar in your inbox later this week. So let's get started. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. Please feel free to post your questions throughout the presentation in the chat box on the right side of your screen. We'll compile the questions and get to as many as we can after the presentation. I'm pleased to introduce our esteemed presenter and expert in the field of neonatal feeding and nutrition, Dr. Richard Schanler. Dr. Schanler is Program Director for the Fellowship in Neonatal Perinatal Medicine at Cohen Children's Medical Center and Northwell Health in Long Island, New York. Nutrition in the NICU is his major research and clinical interest. He's conducted studies focusing on the effects human milk has on the recipient premature infant and how processing affects the composition of human milk, and he has over 100 publications in this area. I'll now turn it over to you, Dr. Schanler.
Thank you, Tammy. I just disclosed that I'm supported by Astardi Medical for this endeavor and nothing else to disclose. I would like to start this afternoon by dedicating this session to Diane Anderson, who we lost recently. She was a terrific educator in neonatal nutrition and responsible for training many of us in neonatal nutrition throughout the world. So today I'm going to talk about why human milk for preterm infants, how do we optimize it with nutritional support, fortification, what happens with growth, where does donor human milk fit in, how do we start with oral colostrum? How do we plan hospital discharge around the feeding of human milk? And if we have time, we'll touch on a little bit of milk handling. All preterm infants should receive human milk, and human milk should be fortified with protein, minerals, and vitamins to ensure optimum nutrient intake for infants weighing less than 1,500 grams at birth. And pasteurized donor human milk, appropriately fortified, should be used if mother's own milk is unavailable or its use is contraindicated. And we've added to that recently, support parents of preterm infants to establish milk supply as an important component in providing this milk. There's lower morbidity from infection-related events like necrotizing enterocolitis, sepsis, urinary tract infection. And in some cases, these benefits persist beyond the NICU stay. There's survival free of sepsis, necrotizing enterocolitis. And these data from Europe show that if the proportion of mother's milk on day 6 to 10 is more than 50% of intake, those infants have a significantly greater survival free of sepsis and necrotizing enterocolitis throughout their hospital stay compared to infants who receive less human milk that at that time. There's a very interesting analyses of comparison of diets and the major disease outcomes of prematurity: necrotizing enterocolitis, bronchopulmonary dysplasia, and retinopathy of prematurity. And these data are controlled for the usual multiple factors that affect outcomes of premature infants, as shown on this slide. So, for example, necrotizing enterocolitis, when there is exclusive human milk feeding, the odds of developing NEC are over 12-fold greater than with an exclusive human milk diet. And even mixed feeding is greater risk of NEC than exclusive human milk diet. Bronchopulmonary dysplasia, exclusive formula diet, significantly greater in development of BPD than an exclusive human milk diet. And similarly, retinopathy of prematurity, speaking for the antioxidant capacity of the human milk, actually in both of these outcomes, or in all of these outcomes. I want to digress for a second and just show this cartoon that is my simplistic understanding of necrotizing enterocolitis in premature infants. And I'll explain why I'm showing this in a moment. But if we look at a piece of intestinal epithelium, premature infants are characterized by a decreased or diminished intestinal motility. They have a horrible NICU flora microbiome that's trying to gain entry into that circulation. They have increased intestinal permeability. They have a very poor mucus lining, mucus coat, so bacteria can gain entry, the bacterial translocation, and even when some gets in, there's no mucosal immunity in the premature babies to challenge that. And so there's an uncontrolled inflammation, gut barrier failure, platelet activating factor release, bacterial invasion, and intestinal necrosis. And that's what we call necrotizing enterocolitis. Now, the good news is that the feeding of human milk affects virtually all of these areas. Human milk will increase intestinal motility. Human milk matures mucosal immunity, providing IgA, lactoferrin, and immune cells. Prevents bacterial invasion. It provides an enzyme called acetyl hydrolase that if there's any kind of inflammatory response, it might break down platelet activating factor. Human milk actually decreases intestinal permeability, preventing some of this bacterial translocation. It provides a beneficial intestinal microflora and a very important components called oligosaccharides that line the intestinal tract, long-chain sugars that bind many invading organisms. So for all these reasons, human milk is specifically suited for this population of infants. What about neurodevelopmental outcomes in our premature babies? The neonatal network several years ago showed us in over 1,000 babies that the more human milk the infants received in the NICU, and this is up to 80 percentile of intake, the higher the mental and psychomotor development scores of these infants at 18 months. This is 18 months. Few of these infants were still receiving human milk, and these data are corrected or adjusted for the confounders of maternal age and education, etc. These studies were continued to 30 months, and the same patterns were seen in this population. Improvements in the babies who in the NICU had the highest human milk intake, and that were sustained. And the authors say that for every 10 ml per kilo increase in human milk ingestion, the mental development index increased by 0.5 point, psychomotor index increased by 0.6 points, behavior improved, and the likelihood of rehospitalization decreased by 6%. And they further comment that this small increase in scores reduces the economic burden by decreasing the number of extremely low birth weight children who require special education services. Others have shown effects as well. So these data are from Italy, where there's showing the usual factors that help predict developmental outcome. And obviously, a negative predictor is the development of an intraventricular hemorrhage, or necrotizing enterocolitis, or sepsis, long-term mechanical ventilation. But a positive predictor, and one of the few positive predictors, is the feeding of human milk hospital. And these are looking at 24-month follow-up of these infants after the NICU stay. Improved neurodevelopmental outcome at 2 to 5 years of age in preterm infants was shown specifically in those who received breast milk at the time of discharge. And these were 2 studies done in France. The data are combined here, but there was almost a 2-fold increase in normal neurodevelopmental outcomes in infants who were breastfed at discharge compared to those who were not receiving human milk at the time of discharge. And these data also are adjusted for the multiple factors that go into determining neurodevelopmental outcome measurements. In Boston, a study looked at if the predominant human milk diet, meaning more than 50% human milk, for 28 days in infants of less than 30 weeks gestation, if that was the case, the number of days the infants received a diet of greater than 50% human milk had effects on MRI scans at term equivalent age. The MRI showed greater deep gray matter volume. And in follow-up at 7 years of age, there were significant associations with IQ, math, memory, and memory function and motor function in those infants that had, depending on the number of days, those infants had more than 50% human milk in that 28-day period. So the next thing we need to talk about is fortification. When we talk about unfortified human milk, if the infant is feeding a good volume, 160 mLs per kilo per day, this is how much protein they're getting, 2.2, energy, calcium, sodium. All of these are much lower than their needs, which are shown on the right. They need 4.5 grams per kilo per day of protein, 130 calories, 195 milligrams of calcium, and at least 2.5 milliequivalents of sodium per kilo per day. And that's what we get when we add human milk fortifier to the feeding regimen. There have been meta-analyses that have looked at this. There have been Cochrane reviews that have summarized this, and essentially they all show improvements in growth in all parameters: weight, length, and head circumference. They show improvement in bone mineral content. They show improvement in nitrogen balance, and they show higher BUN values. And when I say higher, I mean now they're measurable from being unmeasurable. But perhaps most importantly, they show no increase in feeding intolerance, necrotizing enterocolitis, or mortality with the use of human milk fortifier. In addition, when we look at premature babies in the hospital who receive unsupplemented or unfortified human milk, they have higher and higher alkaline phosphatase values, suggesting calcium and phosphorus deficiency compared to similar infants who have fed preterm formula. When these babies with the highest alkaline phosphatase come back in follow-up, at 18 months, they're shorter than those infants that are receiving preterm formula. And when they come back as adolescents, 9 to 12 years of age, they still have an effect of that high alkaline phosphatase value and their ultimate height. So The Cochrane reviews have concluded that it's unlikely that further studies evaluating fortification of human milk versus no fortification will be performed, but further research should be directed toward comparisons between different preparations and evaluating both short-term and long-term outcomes in search of optimum composition of human milk fortifiers. Well, we had an opportunity to participate in that type of evaluation of proprietary products. Human milk fortifiers in the US prior to a few years ago were powdered preparations. We were concerned about the protein content, the absolute protein content we thought was too low. And we thought that intact protein may have some irritant effect, in the inflammatory effect in the intestinal tract. And we were concerned about that. And the companies reformulated their fortifiers specifically to get rid of the powder, since we don't like to use powdered nutritionals in the NICU since they can't be terminally sterilized easily. So they reformulated to liquid preparations with higher protein content. And even though bovine-based, they used protein hydrolysates, which were hypoallergenic. And then we had another group of fortifiers that came on the market around the same time that were derived exclusively from human milk itself, with no bovine products involved. And we'll touch on that too. So in the new processing of the liquid human milk fortifiers, the manufacturing required that they produce a sterile product, obviously. There were differing methods on how to accomplish this sterility while maintaining nutrient integrity. And they included heat treatment of individual components and then adding them all together, or acidification of the products, and that would be make the product sterile. And both have produced sterile products. However, the acidification process met with some challenges in terms of the babies were developing more metabolic acidosis and requiring more feedings being withheld, fortifiers being changed, being associated with lower weight gain, because all of this probably due to the metabolic acidosis. These infants had a much greater need to be treated with alkaline supplements. Because of the acidosis, the infants had a greater diaper dermatitis. The length of stay was longer for those infants due to the who had metabolic acidosis, and that increased their hospital costs. And there are at least three studies that have looked at that. And so right now we sort of favor the non-acidified approach of a non-acidified human milk fortifier in the management of infants fed fortified human milk. These are liquid fortifiers now. One other question that comes up is, how soon can you start human milk fortifiers? And really, there's not a lot of data on that. And I'll show you two very small descriptive studies. One study looked at fortifying from the first feeding at day 2 compared to delaying it to when the infant received an intake of 85 mLs per kilo per day. So early versus delayed fortification. And they looked at alkaline phosphatase levels, thinking that the infants were getting less calcium and phosphorus if their fortification was delayed. And they found that in the delayed fortification, there was a much higher incidence of high alkaline phosphatase values throughout the hospital stay compared to infants that were in the early fortification group, 36% versus 15%. A separate study looked at early versus late fortification in terms of the achievement of 60 mLs per kilo per day, an arbitrary time point. And they looked at over 300 babies, 27-week gestation. Turned out that the late fortification group had a higher incidence of chronic lung disease They also had poorer growth, and they achieved their 24-calorie full feeds mark at a much later time point. And the analyses all favored growth in the early groups and no associations with morbidity in the early group. So there's some evidence, small, that early fortification works. We use 60 mLs per kilo in our institutions, but again, there's very little study on this area, as you see. How do you fortify milk? Well, this can be very complicated. We can have the standard fortification model, which we use the manufacturer's fortifier and we add it to mother's milk, or we can individualize it, adjust it. We could look at, some studies have shown measuring the BUN values of the babies and then adding more or less fortifier under those circumstances, or targeted fortification, where you actually analyze the milk as depicted here. So you have fat, protein, carbohydrate, you have unfortified human milk and the range of compositions that you see, fortified human milk, and then your target. This is what you want. So you're going to add more or less depending on the variability in that nutrient. And just notice here how variable fat content is in human milk, which is a big characteristic of human milk in use in the NICU. Do the same thing with protein, do the same thing with carbohydrate. This requires an apparatus to measure the content of the milk. This is time challenge for some very busy NICUs, but it has some very good outcomes. So the benefits of a human milk diet are known, and preterm infants should receive that diet. It should be mother's own milk, and there's a need for fortification. But you all know that that's the rosy picture, but the milk is not always available. And we have to decide what's our alternative to feeding these infants if mother doesn't have enough milk to feed her baby, provide this milk for her baby. So what do we do if there's no mother's own milk? We resort to donor human milk. Now, we have to understand what donor human milk is. Generally, donor human milk is milk donated to a milk bank later in lactation, usually by women who deliver full-term babies. So we know that there are changes in nutrient content over time of lactation. Protein content is low, fat content is low, not only because of the timing in lactation, but the collection of milk. Every time it interfaces with a plastic container, some of the fat sticks because the fat is not homogenized, rises to the top of the container, and as the milk is aliquoted, we can lose the fat. And then there's an obligatory need for pasteurization of this milk to prevent transmission of any kind of foreign antigens. And this process diminishes the cells, diminishes enzymes, diminishes immune factors, does away with bacteria, which is the point of pasteurization, but it also does away with the probiotic bacteria, the good bacteria. There's also very rigid guidelines for screening and collecting milk that the Human Milk Bank Association of North America adheres to, and those banks that collect milk follow those guidelines. And I like to think of donor milk as a bridge. In other words, it's not mother's milk or donor milk. It's mother's milk as the feeding plan, but we may need to bridge it for a while until mother's milk volume increases with donor milk. Now, what about the story about donor milk? Well, historically, donor milk was associated with slower growth, especially weight gain, and biochemical abnormalities like hyponatremia and high alkaline phosphatase from calcium and phosphorus inadequacies and low BUN, but better feeding tolerance and less necrotizing enterocolitis. Now, all of these comparisons were with formula. We did a randomized trial several years ago to try to understand this, but the problem is we never have an exclusive donor milk group and an exclusive formula group. So we had to do the randomized trial of pasteurized donor human milk versus preterm formula when they were used as supplements to mother's own milk in preterm infants. And so the strategy was that mother's own milk supply was the key factor here. If it was adequate, the babies continued receiving their mother's own milk. If it was inadequate, the babies were randomized to receive donor milk or preterm formula. All the human milks in the study were fortified as appropriate back in 2005. The major outcome of the study was to look at the incidence of NEC and sepsis as a combined model. And we were, I guess, dismayed to say that the incidence of those combined outcomes was the same in the donor milk group and the preterm formula group, but it was half that amount in the mother's own milk group. We wondered, is donor milk really a proxy for mother's own milk? Well, and we also noticed that the growth rate of the infants in the donor milk group was less, despite having greater milk intakes. And this was a blinded study, and our dietitians were the ones who decided the milk volumes without us knowing which group the babies were in. The donor milk at the time was fortified with bovine human milk-based fortifier with intact protein. And there were some small descriptive studies prior to this time that demonstrated that donor milk doesn't have a lot of inflammatory fighting power, let's say. And if there's a little inflammation induced by bovine milk, there was really little chance of protecting the infant from that, compared to the infant that's receiving a bovine fortifier and mother's own milk. So we questioned the data from that study, and it was fortunate that at the same time we were able to associate with an exclusive human milk diet that avoided bovine protein and was an exclusive donor milk diet. Also at the same time, and soon after that, newer human milk fortifiers came out containing hypoallergenic peptides. And so that was another option that was coming out to avoid intact bovine protein. But let's talk about the exclusive human milk diet first. An exclusive human milk diet that meets the nutritional needs of the preterm infant. The health benefits, meaning decreased TPN, late sepsis, and NEC of an exclusive human milk diet would exceed those of the usual human milk diet containing bovine-based products without detrimental effects on preterm infants' growth. And that was our hypothesis for this very large multi-center study of over 200 infants. And essentially, there was an exclusive human milk group that was a mother's own milk group, but a human milk-based human milk fortifier made from human milk. And if there was not enough mother's own milk, then donor human milk, appropriately fortified, would be used. And that was compared to a partial human milk group that was mother's own milk with bovine-based human milk fortifier and preterm formula if no mother's milk was available. So this was the comparison groups back then. And we found that there were marked differences in the morbidities in those two groups. The partial human milk group had significantly greater incidence of necrotizing enterocolitis, surgery for necrotizing enterocolitis, and mortality compared to the exclusive human milk group, where these entities were very low. These data were corroborated by other investigations subsequent to this study. The infants that had the highest amount of human milk in their diet had the less sepsis. Survival free from sepsis was greater the more human milk in the diet. And more recently, the 18-month outcomes, or 18 to 22-month outcomes of this population was evaluated and reported. and it showed that the exclusive human milk group had higher cognitive composite scores compared to the bovine fortified group, suggesting that there is an outcome, an important outcome for this process occurring. One thing that hasn't been solved yet is weight gain. Now, weight gain is a little difficult to assess sometimes, but the weight gain in the infants was less in the donor human milk group that was receiving human milk-based fortifier compared to mother's own milk with bovine-based fortifier. And we looked at that. We looked at that in our own institution, and we find that the differences are significant, but they may not be biologically different. In other words, the donor milk group infants may be growing 20 grams a day, and the mother's milk group may be growing 24 grams per day. But that needs investigation, and we shouldn't just say that this is the best way to go, but we should be looking at growth in these infants as well. And that's been shown in other avenues as well. There was a study done in Westchester that looked at two different epochs of feeding. In other words, 208 to 209 and 210 to 213. And basically in their second epoch is when they really got into the human milk feeding and the donor milk. And so they found there were more days of human milk feeding, there were more days of donor milk feeding, there was much less necrotizing enterocolitis and surgical neck, but growth was sacrificed. The infants, these are Z-scores for weight and head circumference, were significantly lower in this time compared to previously. So again, this is something we have to contend with now. There is a variable composition of human milk, of mother's own milk, that we have to contend with. Fortified donor milk needs proactive attention. We need to make sure we're providing even more protein, perhaps more energy in terms of perhaps vegetable oil, or using a human milk-derived human milk fortifier that has the ability to ramp up the calorie and protein content of the milk significantly. Let's move on to a little bit more mechanical things of what we're doing in the NICU. And one of the things that we've been trying over the past several years is starting out with oral colostrum in all of our infants as soon as they hit the NICU. We ask the mothers for drops. And actually in the old days, and I'm old enough to know the old days, but if a mother would show us a few drops of milk, like shown on this teaspoon, we would say, okay, that's nice, keep going. You know, we would basically throw this away. And now this is gold, and we put this with a syringe into the buccal mucosa of the baby. You can do this as many times a day as we have this milk available for these infants. Diana Maffei in our institution actually looked at this and found that the oral colostrum dose, the more doses the babies receive, the higher the IgA level is and the lactoferrin level in these infants. And we looked at measuring this in the urine as a proxy for absorption, and significant increases with the number of doses of colostrum that the babies get. One of the things we noticed in our first study was that we were getting colostrum at 32 hours, which was ridiculous. We expected this at an hour of age, and we never thought that it would take this long. And so most of our strategies now are trying to work with mothers to get colostrum much sooner for their babies. So much so that we have a lot of time spent in trying to work with our staff in our labor and delivery units. The total doses in the first 72 hours weren't that dramatic, and we want to improve on this. And only about a third of the babies received any colostrum in the first 24 hours. So there was a lot of work to be done that was shown by this first investigation. The number of doses in the first 24 hours also depicts how many the babies are going to get, how many doses the babies will receive in 72 hours. And there are also other people have investigated that there are differences in the oral microbiome with oral colostrum. And all I see here is different colors basically, and even that I have trouble with. So, but the colostrum fed babies over time have a different pattern of bacteria than the control babies, and so much so. And we even looked at Shannon Diversity Index, which we like the infants to have more diversity and not less diversity. And so the number, if it takes so long to get colostrum, there's a negative effect on this diversity. So we want to try to get this early into our babies. We also found that there was a dramatic differences in how the colostrum is administered to the buccal mucosa. If we use the standard swab, which how we started this study, we didn't get any absorption. But it was only when we switched to a syringe that we knew that we were delivering to the buccal mucosa some milk, do we see marked absorption of both IgA and lactoferrin. And one other thing that I feel is intriguing and needs substantiation is the observations from Florida that the sooner you initiate milk expression, the better your milk volume is for 42 days. And when you tease apart the data from this study, find that in the first hour, if you start milk expression in the first hour, you have better volumes, significantly better, over 42 days in the time in the NICU. And I think this, our oral colostrum strategy fits right into this. And so we try to counsel mothers as soon as possible to give us some colostrum. And we're studying now, does this have an effect on milk volumes? Well, let's get our baby now to discharge. And so how are we going to determine how we're going to continue human milk feeding at discharge? And so this becomes a little difficult challenge. We want to ask 3 questions generally. Can the baby consume an ad libitum volume of milk? Can the baby gain weight? Has the baby been gaining weight adequately? And maybe even are they above the 10th percentile? And do they have normal nutritional indices close to the time of discharge? Very few of our babies can say yes to all of these questions close to the time of discharge, I mean a week or 2. But if they can, then that baby can go home on a standard diet of breast milk and breastfeeding, or if it's a formula baby, standard term formula. But those who can't do this, we need to have a strategy to provide a diet that supplements mother's milk. And we've been trying concentrated formula boosters, alternating human milk with formula, human milk mixed with formula, and most recently human milk plus human milk fortifier after discharge. And we have starting to look at this in terms of we're getting some better growth with this. But one of the things we found is when we send babies home from the NICU with a specialized diet, we have to know how long we're going to keep it. We have to give the pediatrician parameters on how to adjust it. And many times we omit this point, and we find the mother says that the pediatrician just substituted something different after discharge. So all this has to be done before the baby goes home. And the idea of fortification comes from the study in Toronto that looked at a very intense intervention strategy with 12 weeks of half fortification, and found that there was improvements in weight and length in their population, as bone density as well at 12 months. So not every study has shown these dramatic differences, but we think there may be something here in terms of providing additional nutrition after the babies go home. So we use colostrum care, we use trophic feedings, we tend to wait for mother's milk if it means another day or so, or we use donor milk. Unfortified, we fortify at 60 mLs per kilo per day. And then advanced feedings, at least to a target of 160, but this isn't gold, and we can go up to 180 or 200 per kilo, as has recently been shown. We do nutritional monitoring, weight, length, head circumference, and percentiles and D-scores, and a few nutrition labs during the hospital stay. And when the baby's about half their oral feedings, we start discharge planning. And if a baby needs, for medical reasons, a conservative fluid regimen, we make sure that we're providing optimum nutrition, even though the water is less. So I have about 3 minutes more. I'm just going to mention a couple of things that we've looked at in terms of handling the milk in the NICU, and this will be very brief. Question comes up about bacterial cultures, and I think we've sort of squashed this for now, but we found we compared initial cultures of milk and subsequent cultures, and basically there's no correlation between initial or subsequent milk cultures, and most importantly, milk cultures do not correlate with any pathological isolates from the infants. And so there's really no reason to get milk cultures, because you're going to be going crazy when you start looking at all the variety of flora that you can get in terms of gram-positive, gram-negative even, and mixed flora, and also all the type of species that are encountered. And all of these were found in our milk samples, but none of the babies had infection due to any of these organisms. And then refrigerator storage. And we looked at this from a very comprehensive evaluation. And we said, how long can you store milk in the refrigerator at 4 degrees centigrade? And a variety of, we looked at bacterial colony counts, and we found that over time they keep going down. So this isn't a reason not to store milk in the refrigerator for 96 hours. Cells go down, okay, but they're still present at 96 hours. Milk pH declines during this period of time, but actually this decline is still higher or around what we see with pasteurized donor milk. And so this doesn't seem to be a problem under those when we use that as a comparison. And free fatty acid levels rise, thinking that there's some lipolysis in the milk as it sits in the refrigerator. But these values, even though they're rising, they're no different than what we see in pasteurized donor milk. So we think milk can stay in the refrigerator for 96 hours and still be used. What about long-term storage of milk? And we tested the same parameters with 9 months of milk storage at -20 degrees and found some very interesting observations. Bacterial colony counts declined really nearly to zero over this period of time. If we left the milk in the refrigerator for 72 hours and then froze it, the decline was even more dramatic, seen in the red bars here. That's total bacterial colony counts. Milk pH declined, and so we feel that, we feel that we can store milk during that period of time. The question is that what is that milk at 9 months with no bacteria in it, or even at 3 months when we see the declines there? What does that mean? Does that help explain the differential outcomes of some babies that are receiving human milk and not all of them are 100% protected? So I leave that up to further experimentation to be done. I want to just mention one other thing. We talked about donor milk a lot, and I was reading on the internet the other day, and I saw this ad. A healthy 30-year-old mother delivered twins, and she says no underlying diseases, illnesses, no use of drugs or alcohol. She takes a prenatal vitamin every night. She's willing to sell her fresh or stored frozen milk, frozen within a 6-month time frame. Just let me know what works best for you. PayPal only. So we discourage this 100% or more. Internet milk is not to be used in the hospital, and I would never use it at home as well. This milk is not screened. It represents a health risk. No documentation about the milk, and it comes from a single donor. And there's some advantage to coming from a pooled donor. Some of the things that might be occurring in there might get diluted out. So I caution you and to be aware of that when you're receiving milk in the NICU for your premature babies. So human milk diet in the NICU is required. We should ensure growth to meet nutritional needs with fortifiers. We should assist mothers in maintaining their milk supply. This is a very critical factor here. And we should plan post-discharge human milk diets in enough time where this could be realized. So I thank you for attention, and I'll certainly be available for any questions that may come up.
Great, Dr. Schanler, thank you. If you could stop sharing and then go back to your webinar screen and turn your video on, we'll take some questions. All right. All right, the first question is, does exclusive human milk diet in the associated morbidity slide include or exclude cow's milk-based fortifiers? That question was asked early in your presentation.
Say that one more time, because I think there's a wording in there that's not. Go ahead.
Does exclusive human milk diet in the associated morbidity slide include or exclude cow's milk-based fortifiers?
Right. So the exclusive human milk diet that I was referring to is donor human milk entirely. Basically, it's a fortifier made from human milk and donor milk on top of that. No cow milk products involved with that in the last study that I showed. Yeah.
Oh, great. The next question, with targeted express breast milk fortification, how often would you test the express breast milk in order to adjust the custom fortifier?
We're not doing that because of the complexity of that, and so I would say that once or twice a week you would have to do that, maybe even once a week to do that if you're using it that in that manner. We actually look at growth of our babies and BUN values, and that helps us adjust our parameters as well. That's the sort of the poor man's approach to doing the targeted fortification.
Okay. In the study comparing exclusive versus partial human milk, was the bovine-based human milk fortifier using hydrolyzed protein?
No. So all the studies that those studies are with intact protein. So we would love to do a comparison study of hydrolyzed protein fortifier in comparison to exclusive donor human milk diet.
Okay. The next question, in the growth studies of fortified exclusive expressed breast milk versus fortified donor human milk, where lower growth was noted, was there an adjustment in the protein fortification to adjust for the lower protein content of donor human milk?
No, and that's the issue that we have to contend with, is that we should be aware of that so that we can even be proactive about it and adding more protein. We use a liquid protein preparation in many of our babies, actually, who fit in this category. Yeah, no, you have to do that proactively, and we didn't use it.
Okay. How long do you apply milk to the buccal mucosa with syringe? Do you only do it while receiving colostrum or until oral feedings are able to be started?
No, we do it as long as we have colostrum, but if mother is providing us breast milk for her baby and the baby's feeding the milk, I think you're getting the colostrum and the transitional milk that way. So we do it as long as the baby is not yet receiving mother's milk. And, we don't have a time where we have to stop it, but I don't think it's as necessary once the baby's getting their own mother's milk.
Okay. Is there any evidence that would preclude adding fortifier to the first feeds? Why wait to 60 mLs per kilo per day or some even higher volume?
That's a great question because, as I showed you, nobody really knows the answer to that. We always worry, we worry a little bit about introducing anything to the gut then we worry about introducing more of what we did yesterday, and then we worry about adding anything to that milk. So it's just our natural anxiety about this. But no, I don't see any. There's no problem that I'm aware of. We could just start with it. In the old days, we started with 24 calorie formula when we used formula before we really got into the human milk bandwagon.
Okay. The next one is, we know breastfeeding is important for fragile preemies as well as for the mother. Oftentimes, it's hard for mothers to switch their baby from 100% bottle into some breastfeeding once home. How do you suggest NICU safely move to some unsupplemented breastfeeding as baby approaches discharge? Do you suggest NICU should prioritize direct breastfeeding for preemies?
Yes. Now, I'm sure a couple of my lactation consultants are on, they're going to scream at me if I say the wrong thing now, but we should be doing breastfeeding in the hospital before the baby goes home, and actually transition the baby that way. So when the baby goes home, they're not only a bottle-fed baby, they're getting breast milk, breastfeeding, and then sometimes it's also with a bottle. Sometimes we've used a cup in the past, but basically we can transition them off. But we want to start it early in the hospital, not after the baby goes home.
Okay. Is there any study that compares an exclusive human milk diet using a human milk fortifier versus a hydrolyzed bovine human milk fortifier?
No, but maybe with Astarte can support that study so we can do that. That needs to be done, actually. That would be a next way to go with that. Yes.
Okay. Is human milk fortifier available to families as an outpatient?
I don't market that, so I don't know if that is available. I assume it's available. It's a really precious resource, so I don't know that I would recommend it for that purpose. In all of our studies, and even in our practical use of the human milk fortifier, we sort of stop it after the period of time when the baby is most prone to develop necrotizing enterocolitis. So we don't continue it very long because it's quite expensive.
Okay, that sort of leads into the follow-up question that said, if so, is expense within reach or covered by insurance? So it is to a point. It's covered by insurance. Yes, it took us quite a while to get that going, but it is working now. But it's still a major expense. Now, that's when I put on my administrative hat. In a NICU, if I have a baby who's has an IV infusion and an IV pump and an incubator, I'm paying thousands and thousands of dollars a day for that. I'm talking about now a few $100s a day for this human milk fortifier. So, the ballpark, it's greater than zero, but it's nothing like what else we pay for in the NICU. So. Okay. Can you comment on probiotics and human milk among preterm infants, donor milk versus mother's own milk?
Well, certainly there'd be no probiotic bacteria in donor milk. There's no bacteria in that milk. As I mentioned, the longer we store the milk in the freezer, the lower the bacterial colony counts are, and therefore we lose the good probiotic bacteria also. So fresh mother's milk or short-term stored mother's milk is still the way to go to get that good probiotic bacteria.
Okay. Does loss of bacterial colonies mean loss of probiotic bacteria?
Yes. Yeah. It pretty much goes together. We actually looked at that. I didn't show you the data for that, but bifidobacteria and lactobacillus are also declining, as well as the total bacterial colony counts.
Do you ever recommend supplementing breast milk with 30 cal formula upon discharge for babies needing the extra calories and nutrients?
So, I think every prescription we've gone through. So it's not, when you say, did I ever? Yes, we have done that. Some people call that a booster feeding, and then the rest of the feedings can be breast milk, mother's own milk, kind of thing. So there are different strategies, and I think, certainly none of them are evidence-based. The only evidence that we have now is a short 12-week period of half fortification showing some better outcomes at a year of age. That's it. So anything else that we've talked about has not been studied.
Okay. Then we have two questions that are very similar. So you would recommend supplementing preterm babies with probiotics?
Well, we're looking into that right now. The data are actually quite exciting in that area. We're doing the trial ourselves, so we should have some answers in the future.
Okay. How do you get started giving mother information about breastfeeding?
Well, we actually got concerned about this when we found out that we weren't getting colostrum as early as we anticipated we would. So now, as a neonatologist, we do antenatal counseling of mothers who are going to deliver a premature baby. And one of the things that we tell them and emphasize is, here's something mother can do as soon as the baby is born, is get a pump or use manual expression to give us like that little teaspoon of milk to provide to start the ball rolling. And we will use any drop that you get for feeding your baby. So.
Okay. And let's see, the next one is, what are your thoughts on alternatives to pasteurized donor milk? For example, sterilized milk.
Okay, so sterilized milk, I've not seen any clinical studies of that, so I really can't comment on it. I think we have to be evidence-based about everything we try.
Okay. It looks like we ran through all the questions, so I want to thank you so much for your time and insights, and have a great day.
Thank you very much. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.